the whole idea is to rearrange our thinking back to the fact that we are in Eden right now. Nature is providing abundance of food and medicine and valuable materials. Most of the plants that are here that we consider invasive were brought here by people as foods and medicines. So this is the empowerment that I think is really important, is realizing that our main healthcare provider is ourselves, and the more we learn and discover about ourselves, the more we learn about nature. Use the mint for its aromatic qualities. And if a plant has aromatic qualities, that means it has medicinal qualities. Those are the smell of chemicals. Those are chemicals that you smell. And those are very potent chemicals. And sometimes they could be millions of chemicals combined. And the plant is very intelligent in why and how it's creating those chemicals. This is called Canada thistle. Thistle, think of bristles. Thistles have bristles. And you can see that this thing is chock full of spikes. How, as a society, can we turn our idea as vegetable and look at weeds as vegetables? It's local, it's free, it's organic, it's sustainable, it doesn't require a lot of farming, it doesn't require a lot of water. When we live in a suburban area, urban area where there's so much pollution, something like dandelions is a cleanser, it's a blood cleanser, it's a kidney cleanser, it's a liver cleanser. The plants that come up naturally are already foods and medicines. So I think we need to develop a mixture of gardening as well as harvesting the weeds, as well as allowing these weeds to grow. Once you have that connection, it gets inside of you and it starts to awaken you. So I'm just trying to be a facilitator of this connection with people. So really the message is that food and medicine is all over the ground and we've totally forgotten. And even by the side of the road here is a familiar ally called yarrow. Everybody knows about this plant in the herbal world. Good for wounds, good for infections, all kinds of things. 1,000-leafed. This could be kind of like the rollish clippy stuff.
Yeah.
You could do some bok. You're not even really allowed to say the word medicine. That's a
Yeah.
good. But it's referring to a plant, and like it's kind of like, well, I'm nuts.
Yeah.
I believe plants are. I also believe that light is medicine.
Yeah.
I also believe that breathing is medicine.
Yeah.
I believe that walking barefoot is medicine. So maybe in the relativity, the philosophical relativity. Another thing we could do is like loop down that way. If you don't want to hit that way.
Yeah, sure.
A little easier on the way. So, these are a fern. You know about bracken fern?
No.
So these are bracken fern. They're the edible fern, but they're the wrong place. So they all have a U shape under the stem. And that's how you identify the bracken fern. So you'll always remember that as long as you remember that. If you look at a fern, they have a fiddlehead, and there's this U shape.
Oh yeah, look at that.
The U-shaped stem. None of the other ferns have that. So they intentionally plant bracken fern as an ornamental, and nobody knows it's even food.
Oh, wow.
Hello.
That's what I brought you, Agatha. But I never even got to the fiddlehead.
Really?
Yeah.
Yeah, they're like a huge gourmet, like Walgreens. No, not Whole Foods. The other big one.
Wegmans?
Wegmans is tearing these things up and selling them. And so, you know, out of how much they pick, how much actually gets to the store. Out of how much gets to the store, how much actually gets sold. So then you're dealing with like ravaging these plants, which are actually hundreds of millions of years old. Those are some of the oldest plants in the world. They produce by spores. And at a certain point, you can actually turn it over and you see all these little dots. So, namaste. And you can see all the spores on the underside, and that's from, this is prehistoric. So these plants outlived dinosaurs.
Wow.
Right, they've been here through all the mass extinctions that you can possibly think of. They've just been sitting there like, oh well, we'll see you next time.
Oh, amazing.
So they used to be huge, of course. And the dinosaurs would eat ferns. There were huge trees like evergreens.
Oh.
Now they're just little tiny ornamental things that go back to sleep, everybody.
Every time I see them, I just think of the wind before time.
Yeah, exactly. Which is a really like powerful message. the van. It's not good to get hit by vans during your filming. More edible bits.
Plant walk.
Surprisingly, not many people would realize, but just observing. So what I'm trying to do is just scan a large area and stretch my senses. I believe that's a very medicinal function for going out into nature and going into biology or studying animal tracks or watching birds or anything. You get this very big push on your sensorial capacity. That's something I think we've lost tremendously in our culture. So just by scanning in that way, I actually was like, oh, catnip. Not many people could point that out that quickly, but that's when you're scanning for resources, you always watch. So it actually turns out that this is going to smell like cat pee-pee. That's what I think anyway. It smells like cat pee.
Yeah.
But it's a bad association. Not the nicest thing to make you think about. I'm trying to turn you on to a plant. But that is essential oil. And that essential oil is medicinal. Every plant has an essential oil, which is taken out of the plant, and that's what we familiarly know as an essential oil bottle. And this here actually is chock full of it. And so I think of the essential oil being like the blood of the plant, or the part of the plant that actually does keep bacteria and viruses in check. So we're taking that out, and we call that an essential oil, but the plant already has it. And again, we've forgotten that the whole plant has something that a piece of the plant doesn't.
Right, and my studies have shown me that we need to eat food in its whole state. Never a part of the food. And essential oil is only a part of that food. But the plant is the whole food, the food in its whole state.
So you're saying that oranges, vitamin C is not a replacement for oranges.
Exactly,
Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah.
And even chickens, you know, they're eating chicken breast, chicken breast, chicken breast. Eat the whole entire chicken. Organs, everything.
Definitely makes sense. I've been trying to make broth with the whole chicken and the whole like inner content, so I'll at least drink it. But it's kind of freaks me out a little bit too, like eat animals' livers and parts and things. It's definitely something that I didn't grow up in my upbringing.
You did it?
No.
See, I did growing up Italian. That's my parents.
I did too, but my dad's generation was kind of a protest, you know, of like not wanting to eat those kind of weird things. That wasn't really in my family's household. Here's another great one, of course, mugwort. Another aromatic plant. Blue on the underside. You can really see a difference of the colors. So this is, of course, a superhero in almost every indigenous culture that it grows in. And traditional Chinese medicine reveres it, of course. And it's also called moxibustion in the form of used in acupuncture.
And acupressure.
Yeah, and then we just have another aromatic bitter herb, so stimulates digestion, so it's in soba noodles, and also antimicrobial, and that's generally said to mean kills viruses and bacteria, otherwise known as germs, but it's more simple than that because these species are coexisting with bacteria and viruses, so they're not killing them entirely, they're actually creating with them. There's a lot of nutrient flow, there's a lot of change between those organisms, so they're obviously not eradicating them, they're keeping them in check, they're mediating them, and one of the parts of a whole plant is that it mediates that response. It's not like taking something like an antibiotic, which just kills blindly. This is secreting chemistry in different amounts. Every single plant here is secreting chemistry in different amounts to give it the ability to co-evolve and adapt with what's directly around it, which changes. There are bacteria, there are yeast, there are microbes everywhere. You're
That's
full
part
of
of my
cooties.
parasite. I have 3 different plants that I put together for a parasite.
And mugwort's one of them.
Yeah, mugwort.
Renowned. There's all the Artemisias have really anti-helminthic, I think it's called, properties, which means expels worms.
Yep. So people smoke mugwort too, right?
Yeah, you can smoke mugwort. It's definitely a dream-enhancing herb. It's one of the last living psychedelic plants. I would say that's not targeted as such, but it is very drying to the mucous membranes. Tea is often better, but it's very hard to get a dosage of tea large enough to have something like lucid dreams from this, because the plant is very bitter. So you may need about a cup and a half.
Smoke it to get
Or a tincture. I prefer to tincture it because then it's a concentrated dose and it's not a lot of matter. It's not a lot of material. So that's a refined substance, but that refining that was discovered by the alchemists thousands and thousands of years ago, how to make tincture. And so there's been thousands of years of that process, and it's kind of a very simple refinery that anyone can do versus like synthetic chemistry is not a refinery process that you can do in your backyard. So a tincture or an infused oil, a tea, decoctions, infusions, all of those things are meant for home use, you know, and that's where our power is. Here's my salad bar. This is garlic mustard, which is said to be an invasive plant. For example, people are not really familiar with the idea of eating the invasive plants. That's what I would suggest, versus ever spraying pesticides, which stay in the environment for tens of thousands of years and cause a tremendous detrimental effect to all the species around it. So there are ways to see these plants in a different cultural frame if we realize that eat the most abundant thing that grows locally. That seems to be the most economic, most ecologically sane thing that you can possibly think. So, you know, garlic mustard is a regenerative resource that's local to our environment. I saute with it. I make garlic mustard chips. There's so many things that you can do with it.
Does it taste like garlic?
It tastes like garlic and mustard, indeed. It is pungent and tastes like very strong kale, essentially. It's in that family.
Oh my gosh. Really garlicky.
Yeah, so though cooked is really nice. And like, so sauteed with some eggs or something makes a really great scrambled egg or anything like that. That's an indicator of the kale family, the Brassicaceae, and they all have clusters of flowers, and they all produce some sort of very long wispy seed pod, and so that's producing its seeds. And if you harvested mustard seed, like we fry with mustard seed or press it for oil, they look actually exactly like that. So there's no stopping us pressing garlic mustard seed for a similar oil that we would get out of mustard, and that's how we have to think if we want to switch the whole economy and paradigm to a sustainable pattern. Sustainable model. A sustainable thing. If we want sustainosity. Did you get all that? So the difference of these two plants is that this one is round in the cross section, and this one is square.
So that's in the mint family.
Yeah. So do you know which one this is?
No.
So back to like catnip, this is actually a really special plant, which is a revered women's herb, motherwort.
Oh, motherwort.
Yeah, and so of course
that's good for menstrual cramps.
It's good for all kinds of hormone regulation, which of course menstrual cramps is totally related to. Very good mineral-rich plant, so also helpful for those processes. Said that, like, you know, menstrual cramping has a lot to do with lack of iron and lack of magnesium. So these plants are geniuses at sequestering through their roots those metals and minerals from the soil. That's what they're doing. There's nothing static. This plant, every day, it goes to work and it's sequestering minerals out of rocks. And the bacteria are in on that process, and the mycelium, the mushrooms are in on that process. They're all interacting and they're having experience together, and that's something we're not really taught in biology. It's a living presence. It's a living earth. It's not something that's just happening when you walk past the trail every day. Like one of the analogies I think about is how the internet, we all think of the internet right now. How many people do you think are changing and altering pieces of the internet right in this moment? Right? Everybody's pushing on it. Somebody's coding something new. There's developments. There's websites going up. There's websites being taken down. Millions and millions. So the same thing is happening with the chemistry within plants and the earth. And that's something we weren't really shown in our biological understanding of nature. And that's what needs to shift. It's very alive. Something's happening.
You know, they call mushrooms adaptogens, but all plants are adaptogens. They adapt to every environment, don't they?
In that case, but maybe all plants can adapt to their environment, but they can't all help us adapt to our environment. And that may be what an adaptogen versus an adapter could be. And
adapter.
So all plants can adapt, and all plants can survive great cataclysmic changes. But some of those plants help our bodies do the same. And that was really a modern, adaptogen is a class of herbs which was created in modern communist Russia when they were looking to increase work hours in fields. So it is helpful, it's a good term, it's a very modern term, and it basically means herbs that can really increase your energy output, replacements for coffee that aren't so harmful. So those are helpful, and we need to be careful that our culture doesn't just use plants in a similar way we would use coffee, which is also a plant, of just, the America runs on Dunkin' phenomena where we just power through it with sugar and caffeine, and that's what's causing our economy to run so fast, but also our heartbeats to run so fast. So we need to kind of mellow ourselves down. Those nutritive herbs are almost out of people's diets entirely. Catnip tea.
That's for sure. No.
It's as if I said, why don't you join like a rebel group in the Middle East or something? It's just tea. It's really just tea. So
The beauty about knowing Dan, when I met him, is that, a lot of herbalists, we make things with tinctures and I make a lot of medicine, but it always came in a nice little pretty bag to my house. And I never knew what the actual plant looked like until I started foraging with Dan. And he taught me so much. I mean, he could just identify anything, anywhere. But it was really fun to say, oh, this is what cleavers looks like. Oh my God, this is what, mugwort looks like. Because I didn't know. It was all dried and in a bag.
Yeah. You get to meet your celebrities.
Yes.
That's the greatest thing about playing with plants. You actually can meet the celebrities.
Awesome.
Although you can Twitter just about anybody.
How young were you when you knew you were going to just teach people about herbs and you were really connected with all plants? How old is your memory?
Well, I have some really early childhood memories of always playing in nature, which was customary. I didn't get the internet until I was about 15 or 16. So we played outside, I'm sure everybody hears that.
We were the generations that played outside.
So all of my earliest memories are with a lot of these plants, and I would actually play with them and toys. And left to my own devices, I just would break open plants and look at them, and I would remember the smells and the insides of them. So as I grew up in that way and I got interested in herbs, basically I developed a passion to teach about it. Once I realized that children weren't getting that kind of exposure in their own life, I kind of thought of it as normal. And so then I just had to basically put the names to some of the plants. So my earliest memory, one early memory is with my mom actually in her garden eating sugar snap peas and tomatoes, and just playing in that area was fundamental. So my parents, by them having a small garden, a sandbox, and living next to a cornfield, were just instrumental in my upbringing of loving nature and plants.
Well, the beautiful thing about you, the minute I met you, I fell in love with you. I did. I looked in your eyes and I just loved you. I knew you were doing sacred work. I connected, with you as a healer. And you're Italian, I'm Italian, and how lucky were we to even have a garden? Because a lot of people don't have gardens. And I feel that my upbringing of being Italian really connected me to food.
Yeah.
Because my parents did cook every day, and they did have a garden. So coming from an Italian family, though, it's not too easy and accessible, is it? The work you do, or how are they with that?
Oh, well, it depends on the culture is one thing, but the fact that just our families are connected to European tradition, and I think every culture, minus one or two generations, is a gardening, nature-loving culture, and that's something we seem to be losing in this Americanization process as people come here. So that's one of the things I think is instrumental, is remembering, oh, well, your grandmother used to grow plants, right? And so many people and so many stories I've heard over the years, like, oh, my grandma from Serbia used to pick dandelions and do this and that. And those are the great stories that we're losing as we kind of westernize or acculturize to this. But I think that when you look at the way the paradigm is shifting, it's not showing statistically that healing as a whole is doing very well, or that the industry around healing is encompassing or favored by people. And so that's really the question of what about those traditions can we continue to bring into our modern culture?
And now their lifestyle and your living is going to change because you're going to be traveling with your family in the van.
Yeah.
So
van
talk about
dwellers.
this a little bit.
Well, we basically started an Instagram too, if anyone's interested to join, which is Forager Family Van, and there we'll just be doing updates, as well as we're going to start a Patreon to get different tiers of exclusive material out to people, whether it's medicinal herbs that we make as we gather everything from wherever we're traveling from, or exclusive content of travel footage. I kind of want to make like a travel video log for people to learn to live kind of off the grid and find foods to eat, or bathrooms, or places to camp and sleep. So that's something that we'll continue to kind of document and bring to the people. So the idea was to call it a forage mobile, and to build it like similar to a bookmobile, except it would be stocked full of herbs and all kinds of wild foods that we'd harvest from all over the nation, and show people what's available and how to sustainably harvest or replant that. So that's coming up. Welcome to my van. Here's kind of the provisional situation for now. This has been about 2 weeks of getting this van livable so I can start tour, because classes started to pile up and they just started to come at me. So here's what I have for now. Basically a nice bed and a place to store things, and a nice dry area. So here I have lots of my herbal goods that I'm making and providing along the country. And I just got a bow and arrow from a good friend. And I can show you around back. So here's where I get my spring water. I'll fill these up at springs. Findaspring.com is an awesome spot. I have rice and beans, 5 gallons of it. Got my yerba mate and other herbal goodies. Got some clothes here. Herbal goods everywhere, and my hiking and camping equipment. What this does is it gets me in a backpack for about a week and a half with some food in my backpack, so kind of taking trips. So one of the things I want to do is just set this as basically a foraging mobile, so I can go out into the woods for a couple days, come back to this van, store things up, put drying racks out, you know, dry herbs from all over the country, and then you know, come back to the van, go on tour, and travel to some new location. Follow the seasons, you know, like a modern hunter-gatherer. It's basically my digital mastodon. And hopefully I'll be using wool, so it'll also smell like wool, so it'll be like riding on a machine mastodon.
Cribs, nature style.
Van plan camper style. Yeah, this is the new show that nobody's done yet, you know. So I keep a lot of bulk goods, and definitely fresh veggies. I've been getting a lot of vegetables from farmers and stuff as I just travel. And I think barter will start to happen soon. I'm also making, of course, one of the things I did the other day is I traveled and I taught a workshop. So I made a fermented food, and I'm fermenting it in the van, and that's pretty much all you have to do is keep the water level high enough and then keep this on loose. Luckily it's in a waterproof area, so I'm currently fermenting this. This will be a jar of beautiful cabbage, beets, and ginger, and that'll be a fermented kimchi, which I'll use for my salad greens and everything. So now I can go in the wild, harvest some of the plants we talked about today, make a salad on the fly, all while hanging out in the middle of a park. So this is basically the kitchen, the bedroom, the bath, the driving.
Yep.
That's an added function usually to people's houses.
And fermentations, what do they do for the people who don't know?
Well, basically fermented foods increase bioavailability of nutrition, so the bacteria within the fermentation process break up the cellulose wall of the plants, giving you the ability to digest them easily. So that's why they're very helpful for digestion, but they're also really important for keeping the probiotic counts in our digestive tract, which is as important as anything that you can imagine. They're now found that 90% of your serotonin comes from your gut, which is your happiness, your sanity mechanism, as well as B vitamins are synthesized, D vitamins are synthesized by the bacteria in your gut, and they basically eat your food. You're farming. So you eat your food, the bacteria actually digest it and break it down into individual chemical constituents, and they put that through your intestinal wall. Another issue that we have pretty systemically is inflammatory diseases of the digestive tract, irritable bowel syndrome, leaky gut syndrome. All of those phenomena are from a lack of really eating probiotic food and becoming extremely sterile. So we used to ferment everything as farmers. Not too long ago, it was only about 2 generations. Otherwise, you couldn't survive the winter that way. So we basically just cut ourselves off from not only fermented vegetables, but also sourdough breads. And that's a part with the gluten issue as well, and our allergies to grain. So we're not properly preparing them as we used to for thousands, not millions of years. So enjoy. Ta-da! Should I come at you guys now with like a primitive weapon?
Yeah.
So here's an example of what I've been doing. I have an apothecary down in South New Jersey. What I do is kind of wild craft herbs. This happens to be Solomon's seal, right? True Solomon's seal, not false Solomon's seal. I know how to identify that, obviously. So I'm dehydrating these roots. This is also a native and somewhat endangered plant. This happened to be a place, since I'm traveling and observing, that had a real abundance. So I only took about less than 10% of what was available, and I'll be actually tincturing this and making a medicinal preparation from this, and that's kind of where our wild medicines come from. Wild medicinals come from. Medicinals. Medicinals. I think that's okay. Traditional medicinals. Not medicine. This is not medicine. This does nothing for you. This absolutely has no effect on you whatsoever. Legally, I'm bound by saying
that.
that.
I think it's okay to say medicine as long as you're not saying medication.
I think calling a plant a medicine gets a little fishy, because then you're implying that it does something, and that's illegal. You can't say that anything does anything without clinical studies. But there's something called anecdotal evidence that's completely irregarded, and that's what I would like to build, a kind of website that just collects people's empirical experiences. You can go on there, you say, hey, I drank peppermint tea. How much? Approximately 1 cup. What happened? I had a bellyache. And then they say, well, did it help your bellyache? Say 9 million entries are there, and then you can actually crunch statistics from those entries over time. And you can have a website that's like, oh, well, I'm a new mom, I'm a little scared, could I give my kid peppermint tea? You go on this website, you search that, and they say, oh, well, 9 million moms have already tried peppermint tea for their 2-year-old kid. Turns out that nobody died and everybody was safe. So at least we can have that, which is empirical study, and that's something that's completely disregarded out of the sort of paradigm that we use today, which is clinical studies, which are extremely different than personal accounts. They actually try to take the personal out of that. They study it in a laboratory or use a machine to measure versus you as your human senses. And that's back to the placebo effect, because if it helps you, that's what matters. If you have a bellyache and you take peppermint tea and it makes you feel better, that's also valid. That's really important, and that's effectivity of medicine. No matter what is the chemistry inside of there, it almost doesn't matter at that point. Your bellyache goes away. So. OSHA and bee propolis, that could definitely be a lime formula in itself, for example.
I've been seeing OSHA a lot.
OSHA is a very special plant. Really powerful. I can actually...
What is it? Is it more...
I'll show you. I have it.
For Lyme?
Lyme's disease.
You have?
Yeah.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Shady now.
I make them things for Lyme's too. Yeah. Cold and flu formula.
Yeah, that's also very good against Lyme, for example.
Yeah, and I can, because I have a lot of people in like the wellness world in Vermont that I can show you this.
Please do. Please do. Here's what OSHA looks like. These are 2 root from an herbalist in the Midwest, and then I made tincture from that, but I kept these 2.
This is tincture?
Yeah. No, that's elixir. So if you smell these, they still have that really powerful OSHA smell.
It smells so good.
Yeah. That's the chemistry. That's the medicine.
So what exactly is that?
Well, this is a root underground. This is like a 12-year root, and it had a top to it. So this was harvested in a specific time when the flowering top wasn't really prevalent, because that's when you want the roots. And it's basically an amazing respiratory opener. It's just like if you have, you know, asthma to bronchitis to anything with your respiratory system going on. But of course, it's so potent and powerful and cycles through your bloodstream. So again, most plants prepared have an antimicrobial effect, so colds, flus, etc. Anything that happens to your body is, you know, also backed by viruses and bacteria, which are proliferating and evolving and morphing. And these herbs, taken regularly, of course, help your body mediate that process. So therefore, that helps you prevent getting sick in the first place. Preventative medicine is the best medicine. Best time to treat cancer, long before it ever happens. So that's where food and, you know, herbs are not an alternative market. They're reality. It's not something. Water is not something you can be like, yeah, well, you like water. That's cool. That's your trend. That's your fad.
Your mushroom, is that reishi?
Yeah, but I don't have any of those with me, but they're always available online. Like, if anybody harasses me for doing this, I'll just put them on Facebook Live and be like, look, this is like someone harassing me, having no criminal record, just like trying to be a good person. And that's something that people sometimes have a very scary reaction to me just for existing and don't talk to me. We've had some really fun with that. It's part of the fun of growing your hair this long. That some people, for whatever reason, get put into this sort of cultural expectation, especially after a post 9/11 world, thinking that all men with beards are somehow terrorists. So when we kind of fulfill those illusions, you don't realize how people kind of seize up in fear. So I've had one woman, actually, just because I was parked in front of her house
I remember that
temporarily,
story.
I was GPSing trying to find my friend's location, and she came out of her house and really bugged out on me. And I was, of course, calm as I could be, but she didn't want to hear kind of my story as a human being. I think as she learned that I wasn't her expectation, she felt more and more embarrassed, so therefore more and more triggered and more unwilling to kind of hear, like, look, I'm just a normal human being. Like, hi, my name's Dan. So those are things that we need to push in our society, especially in the times we're in, because we do need to preserve what's left of our freedom of speech and our constitutional right to live like Daniel Boone. So that's what I'm going to try to do for all meetings. So basically my vision is to travel the world and to bring people through live and film to take them to indigenous areas where people are still hunting and gathering and living traditional ways, and preserve that and talk about that and translate that process into the culture and help people to understand where their food comes from. So one example would be like follow the coconut trail and go find wild coconuts, find that they're everywhere in the ecosystem, and then track the whole process of how coconuts turn into coconut milk, which gets shipped, and that whole factory process to get people kind of alert and aware of what's local to their ecosystem, as well as what it takes to get these things to their food source. So this is a very important thing in the health conscious world, and as well as bringing in the idea of botany and ethnobotany really brings people into understanding how cultures survived in the past and how our present culture can survive in a similar way from that same knowledge that we need to preserve. So this is a tiffin. They're customary to use in India for lunches, etc. And it comes with this bowl and then a plate on top and then another bowl. And so I have a 2-bowl system, and then it fastens in with a metal hanger. And I can always bring it to potlucks or places where they're using disposable items. And the reason we want to be careful of disposable items is because a lot of them are lined with petroleum and other natural gas byproducts. That's what makes them waterproof. So we really need to be mindful. At least I would suggest dividing hard plastics from petty plastics. And what I call petty plastics, meaning disposable things that really are for convenience. And that would be a huge shift in our culture if we could kind of get off of disposable plastic forks, knives, etc. And that's a lot of oil barrels being used, and of course that's a lot of wars being fought for those. So that can very much help shift the economy, at least a small part of it. This setup right here would get you tea or coffee and food no matter where without anything disposable. So you can just go into the coffee shop, you can say, hey, I have my own ball jar, can you fill it? And then you have your own teacup. And then this is actually a filter, so actually you don't even have to end up going into a store, because now you don't need tea bags or anything like that. So then you can wild harvest some of the plants we talked about today, or make your own tea blends, and then you just put that in. And even what I do is I don't need to heat the water, so I'll make cold infusions even with coffee. So I keep ground coffee with me, and I keep maple syrup with me, and I could literally make coffee anytime by just pouring this over and leaving it there, and it's cold brew and it's totally
And
delicious.
this filters it?
Yeah, this
from
filters
coming
the
up?
coffee.
That's
And you could also
amazing.
rough grind the coffee if you didn't
Where
want
do
to get
you
a lot
get
of sediment.
one of those?
These are mate straws. They're called bombilla, and that's like the traditional
Where did you
way.
get it?
Any health food store has them.
Really?
I've never seen them before.
I'm gonna look for one.
Yeah, so it gets you...
Because I have nettles in here.
Yeah.
But I have all the nettles is like sitting down here right now.
Yeah, and that works, and then you eat little bits, and it's also helpful for you, so it's a way to strain your tea on the go.
Very cool.
Hello friends, welcome to the universe inside a plant world. So hanging out here with a couple of my plant friends, and I really wanted to show you this beautiful mullein stalk. And also there's power, there's our idea of power, lines. This is another idea of power, and this plant actually is a very powerful medicinal, and we know the flowers are very helpful in case of infections. So many people make infused oils from mullein flowers, which are very rigorous to gather. You know, it takes some time, and you can actually infuse those in any kind of infused oil, and that could be then strained, and you can work with that as a topical for basically cases of heat, inflammation. It can soothe the inflammation. Of course, you should always forage respectfully, that is taking from pollinators, etc. So you should think that through as to where you're taking it. So I would say 10 to 30% of anything that you are harvesting is a pretty good number for flowers. And of course, increase habitat however you can. Plug in my little machine because I just saw my battery is getting low. Ta-da! Survival machine. Welcome everybody. Now that I have my survival machine plugged in, and you're all joined in the portal. The other good thing about this plant, as far as talking about power, is this stalk right here makes fire. And one could, this is a little thick for my taste. Everybody likes different sizes of mullein stalks. But this mullein stalk, if whittled down with a knife, if you get rid of all the edge there and make it nice and smooth, there's a pithy center to this and other plants, and that actually is the base of a hand drill fire. You wouldn't want to use it for a bow drill if you're familiar with that, but mullein stalks of course have a hand drill fire hidden within them. So it's very interesting because I was just camping and in a cabin really, and basically living by the fire, and last night it had rained, and I had been chosen, I kind of try to choose little steps for myself. So in this case, I found this on the ground actually. This is a magnesium ferrocerium rod. Alright, and this one's actually quite a crappy one. It's a little too small. It's not good to learn on, but I have a couple others, the Strike Force, etc. And so for 3 days we lived on the wood stove by lighting fire from this with gathered tinder and charred cloth that I had made previously, and just such a beautiful way to... I was just walking and I realized that, you know, every bit of food that we ate came from starting that fire and having that fire going. So imagine if you lived in a reality right now where instead of seeing power, you know, from power lines, you saw power from the power plants, the powerful plants, right? Or that you would live in a world, or that you could anthropologically experiment with the idea of living in that way to see kind of how far you can take it and to test your skills. And that's really what I envision doing with Return to Nature, is sharing those skills and helping proliferate that. So please help spread the word in any way. If y'all have any questions, please let me know. I'll be checking out lots more plants as I go. I've got some other harvests. Here's a nice one. This is pretty much the dead stalk of basically the precursor to grain, right? These are the grass family, probably a panicum. Funny, the grasses are called panicums, and they contain DMT. Talk about panic. They're like 98% of all grasses or something. Nobody really knows how many grass species contain dimethyltryptamine, but definitely a lot of them. Arundodonx definitely does in the roots. Wouldn't it be a joke if the universe made it so that DMT was actually in lawn grass, like in high concentrations, and we never realized it? And so now basically the dominator culture, with its trying to sterilize nature, created free DMT everywhere. Now that would be a funny conclusion to this mess, wouldn't it? So actually this plant right here is a precursor of other commercial wheat. And what I want to mention to you all, watch out for ticks. I had my first deer tick on me already. It's barely March. We didn't have much of a winter. I have a solution. It's called climate fluctuation. If we would have just called it that, I don't think we would have been dealing with so much stagnation. So that aside, this plant actually was artificially selected. A plant similar to this was artificially selected for larger size grains, right, and bigger yields. And after about 20 or 30, let's say 20,000 years of selecting that, we've created certain, yes, genetic modifications, but that doesn't mean GMOs. There's a whole different argument there. Don't be confused by Neil deGrasse Tyson. This is an artificial selection that does genetically modify the seeds. And I want to talk about the precursors to why someone would pick this plant. And so as a hunter-gatherer society starting to become agrarian, what ended up happening was we started to grow more grain. And basically we are in the midst of what started off as a grain war. And Egypt was one such kingdom, and something was going on in Jerusalem. It's hard to tell at that time. We had Sumeria or Babylon, depending on which age you're looking at. China also. And they all had grains. You know, they all had basically the ability to start a commerce system based on sequestering grains, and money is known to have come from barter, for example, because basically you'd get taxed. You as a peasant needed, you worked on the fields, you needed, at the end of the day, $10 worth of grain, so you'd go to the cash-in store, the banker, and they would give you $10 of grain, and you would go and you would continue to work in the field, and you were a farmer, you worked monoculture, and you basically worked as a peasant. And then there was the monarchy. So this is pretty much the society that we entered, probably 10,000 BC. And this has been going on ever since, and it's just gotten more and more out of control. And of course it went from grain to gold to sugar to tea to oil. And now we're in a fossil fuel war, or we're in basically a battle royale of energy sources, which there's one huge one, of course, called the sunlight, which would be kind of a socialist. The sunlight is all about socialism. It's like, hey, free energy for everybody, no problem, just build solar panels, you'll never have to fight over all this shit again. But no, you know, the children. So that dominator culture, which kind of has enslaved us, through the question of grain, we don't realize, but botanically, we selected by certain characteristics that may not have actually benefited the resilience of the plant or the resilience of the physical body, not to mention the mind or the spirit. So when you select seed for money, you usually do it based on two characteristics: size and sweetness, generally. When you think about berries, right? So blueberries are not what they are wild, right? I go pick wild blueberries, they're very small. You go out and you buy blueberries in the store. Some of them could be abnormally, obnoxiously, silly, huge. And that's because basically there was this selection for certain characteristics, which is generally size and sweetness. What happened as a result of that is that we basically thought we were outsmarting nature, but in essence, nature, we started to break nature. That's the first time we kind of started to manipulate nature with human will, thinking that we're basically the co-creator here, which leads to, oh, I'm the dominator here. Nature is at my will because I'm so powerful, based on power plants. Yeah, the power plant. Isn't it funny that nature tricked confuse people into still calling it a power plant. Back to DMT in the grass. But anyway, so this plant has basically been one of those precursors. It's called foxtail grass, and it grows pretty much everywhere and would grow in somewhat monoculture, like in meadows where they wouldn't mow. But of course, during power lines, they not only mow a lot, but they also spray pesticides, because they have the idea that a itty-bitty plant like this may cause a fire for that. So these places get heavily treated, so we wouldn't necessarily want to harvest them from food, but you leave it alone and it would create a grain polyculture. Very interestingly enough. So here we would have a grain polyculture in a meadow. Welcome friends, the power plants are with us. D. Buckley says, could always splice plants that put our higher voltage, like potatoes and other plants making a power plant. Well, you can't actually splice that much of a diversity of plants. Basically, if you start doing splicing and you don't do anything too bizarre or toxic to the plant, what you probably would find is that you can only splice plants. And this is to D. Buckley's question, which says, you could always splice plants that put out higher voltage like potatoes and other plants, making a power plant. Both, I imagine you mean metaphorically as well as physically. Potatoes do generate electricity, and you can get a light bulb to turn on from potatoes. So they do have electrical charge. They also have Krillian energetic response, also an aura. We will come to realize someday that those are all the same exact thing. And so potatoes actually have the ability to emit a charge. Now, that said, you wouldn't be able to necessarily splice a potato with foxtail grass. For example, you would probably need to narrow it down by family, botanical families. So you could probably splice grasses with grasses. Common example that comes to mind is actually cannabis and hops are in the hemp family. And sometimes what people do actually is they'll splice hops roots with cannabis upper portions of their plants. So, and they take, and that causes a certain hybrid. There are also a lot of genetic hybridizations for creating tulips, for example, etc., etc. A lot of that is done in the lab, causing splicing, which they do often use root hormones. So you can get a little further that way. If you wanted to replace root hormone, which is probably some sketchy chemical, you can actually use concentrated willow bark tea that has its own rooting hormone in it. So if you did want to experiment with trying to make frankenplants in a way that was not harmful or deadly to our species, then you can definitely work with willow bark tea, which is easily available all over the woods, as long as the woods remain a place that you're allowed to go. As long as it is true that in most parks, if you go there and you start harvesting willow bark tincture, they do have the law on their side to say that you are illegally removing vegetation when, they prune all the time. Let's see. So, do I carry a flashlight at all? No, I actually barely use a flashlight. I even set up my hammock in the dark. I have one in my camping kit, and luckily it's actually solar powered. I have a small solar charger and an anchor. It's about $30, and that goes and plugs into my headlamp, which is a diamond, and that actually has a USB charge. They're starting to make the first headlamps, so that's about $50, which is, and then that has rechargeable batteries, which I can then charge off of other devices. And so that's kind of the way that I try to go. Now, the eyes adjust. The more you're outside, the more you observe, and the less you use light, the more you adjust. And also, it's two ways of walking. There are a million of ways of walking, but when you walk in the dark, you don't walk like you do in the daytime. So you slow down, you crouch your knees, you move slower, you put your arms in front of your face so that no sticks get you, whack you in the face, or vines, anything like that, and you would move extremely slowly. You wouldn't trudge through the woods like a modern person. So those are kind of the practices that we have to remember. But yeah, that's a pretty good flashlight, and that's some good gear, and I think that's one of the ways that you can get yourself off of the system in a little bit. I mean, I should say start weaning yourself from the system, and that's a very important distinction. That's what happens when you read comments as well as talk. Yeah, I think Yulka says, good to know those areas are treated. I definitely think that they are treated. I've never seen under power lines, at least anywhere that I've ever been, which is overgrown. It's actually diverse. They don't, what is the word? They don't actually they don't actually like monoculture it, but it is pretty much kept away. Fidgeting a phone. Be right back. Hello, friends. Yeah. Also, your phone is a flashlight, so don't forget that. Chrissy mentions, I bought willow bark to propagate plants. You can make one at home with a high enough concentration? Yes, you sure can. You don't need rooting hormone. You could just cook down. I mean, you could probably even boil it, but I would just say simmer down willow bark tincture till it gets, in tea, willow bark in water, and you then can just simmer it down until it gets pretty thick. And I know there's rooting hormone in there. Willow and elderberry, two of very few trees which you can take a cutting and stick it anywhere in the ground, and you can actually grow it. So they're pretty resilient, and they're pretty self-creating. Looking at birch, this is one of the things that I worked with for that fire tool that I was mentioning before, ferrocerium or magnesium. And so this is not the birch I would work with. This is a white birch, and this would be okay. You can make this work, but I also found a whole bunch of paper bark birch. That's one of the good ones. It's much fluffier. It's much easier to take a spark. So restocking from the weekend of hanging out with Sage and Angie in a beautiful cabin and just living by the fire and teaching Sage all kinds of naturey things. And today we went for lots of great walks, and yesterday as well. So basically the vision is to just continue to try to get this van, the Forage Mobile, going and start taking Sage and Angie around, traveling and touring and doing workshops, sometimes all together, sometimes just by myself, and just starting to travel around and forage and look at the world differently and share with you all what I find. So if you're interested in to support this work to continue to thrive, please feel free to check out my GoFundMe page, gofundme.com/return to nature. And there you can see the vision I've put forth for the gypsy van culture. I think it's very important. I've done a lot of research in vans and van dwellings, and the idea is that I think there's going to be people who get land or have land, and then there's going to be people who are roving, and those two kind of cultures are going to be the foreground of the return to nature, where we basically build the eco-villages from the ground up together and stop waiting for politicians to do it. And Standing Rock was the first of many of those explosions of creative, loving, powerful, prayerful energy. And that's going to continue, and so I see some of us are gypsies and we want to rove, and we'll be like the hunter-gatherers riding on mastodons in the form of fossil fuel vehicles that hopefully and prayerfully, if we get the right minds together, we'll build modifications for those engines to run on multiple sources. Innovation is not dead, it's suppressed. And we need to find the others, and we need to start thinking globally and acting locally, to quote such a wonderful cliche, but very true. So, be the one that you've been waiting for. It's time to wake up, and it's time to relearn your home and to be a protector of your home and to look at what's happening in your ecosystem, and all of these teachings and tools start plugging you into paying attention to what's going on. And if we don't have people who pay attention, then that's exactly how a lot of environmental devastation starts to happen, if you've noticed. So remember that you are significant and that you have a role to play in the awakening of human consciousness, and continue to spread your magic however you can, however you will. Sending you all many blessings. Have a beautiful evening. Om.